In reflecting on her journey with cancer, Sally Wolf said this: "Would I have wanted to go through this? No. But there are some things for which cancer deserves a little bit of a thank you note." At our 20th Harvard College reunion, Sally shared that her life hadn't played out as she had expected in many ways, in some part due to the trauma of her cancer diagnosis. In our conversation today, we talk about how cancer has changed her identity, her relationships, and her experience within her own body. Let's get started. Sally, it's so fun to have you on for this conversation. And, we have come a long way in a very short time in terms of our friendship. And I'd love for people to know how we first met. It was actually at our Harvard 20th reunion. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's already been about 5 years, and it feels like I've known you for so much longer. So going back to that reunion, I came to that reunion in a very different place than I thought I would be at our 20-year mark. And I had spent the past year on a breast cancer journey, and I probably had about an inch, maybe 2 inches of hair on my head when I came back there. Uh-huh. And you had invited me to be on a panel that you were pulling together of our classmates. And I remembered thinking, wow, I'm not coming back here with perhaps the list of accomplishments I would have expected by 20 years or with any recent success story to share. I wasn't married. I didn't have kids, which seemed to be what most people were sharing when they wrote their Red Book entries. And I just sat down when I wrote that and said, here's where I am. And it's not where I expected to be. And some of that has been really scary. And I've also had some really amazing moments on this journey. And you read that.
Yes, I did. Because in the last, 20 years, I've really been focused on helping people work through traumas. And a lot of that has been with our nation's warfighters. And so I have a very finely honed radar for courage. And I read the Red Book, which is the Harvard updates from alumni. I was looking for people with courage. And your story really stood out to me about all of the journeys that you had taken with your health and just being so authentic. And I thought, I want her on that panel because it was all about people whose lives had taken twists and turns that they didn't see coming, people who had pursued unconventional paths. And so I was really hoping you would join us, and you were wonderful.
Thinking back to that Red Book entry when I was writing it, you used the word courage. And I just remember sitting there thinking, I'm just writing this where I am in this moment and not fast forwarding ahead and not reflecting back with judgment, right? Mm-hmm. About this, this is anything other than this is what this is. And what I've not missed a single reunion. I don't think that we get credit for perfect attendance at them, but I've been to them all. And I just remember sitting down to write that thinking, I'm definitely going to be there. I think we write them about, 6 or 7 months before the reunion. So I'm definitely going to be there. And I don't know exactly where I'll be in, 7 months from now, but here's where I am right now. And so just that, you use the word courage. And I think there's that reality, that mirror moment of that, of we may be scared to share something, but when it's our truth and we share it in a way that is just open and says, here I am, other people notice. And it's a beautiful opportunity to connect.
And that is the heart of courage, because it's not the same thing as being brave. I also work with some of the bravest people in our society, but bravery and courage are not the same thing. Courage really comes from showing people what is in your heart. So it's kind of like there's an emotional dimension of bravery that is all about courage. And the interesting thing that we've both talked about is how that panel changed the reunion, not just for the people on the panel, but for the people who attended that panel and others who interacted with them. And we both noticed it. Tell us what that experience was like on the panel.
I remember sitting up there. I think there were about 4 of us plus you, so 5 of us who shared our stories, and thinking, initially, what a privilege, because everyone there, and I know we had it at 9 a.m. or some super early time slot for a reunion. So the room was pretty full, but not even everyone was able to hear it. And then, of course, the people who didn't hear it were like, oh, wow, I heard I missed something really special. But I was sitting there looking out at the, semi-full room and just remember thinking, wow, what a privilege to be up here, to be sitting alongside classmates, one of whom I knew well. I had met Allison freshman week, and some of whom I had never met before, including you. And hearing the stories that I'm pretty sure none of us would have had the courage to share back in college, or even maybe at our 10th reunions. I just think there was, you get to this point where real life happens. And yes, some people for sure had a lot of that even by the time we got to school. But I don't know how open people felt in their capacity or even interest in standing out, right? There's this irony. You get to Harvard, so hard to get in. So many of us I wanted to go since I was 13 because I read somewhere it was quote unquote the best. And, I didn't even know exactly what it was, but I wanted to go to Harvard. And I did everything I could to stand out on my application. But then once I get there, I don't really want to stand out in a crowd, to be different. My mom, for example, had breast cancer when I was in high school. And I don't even think I wrote any of my college essays about that, my admissions essays, let alone talked about it. It wasn't a secret, but it also wasn't something that I openly shared in college. And, fast forward all these years later, and I couldn't not share it in the Red Book. And I couldn't not share it on that stage, because when we share, right, and all of us were up there with different stories, but when we share, it gives someone else who hears our courage the chance to say, me too. And
I definitely, from all of that, projecting this image of who you are, right, that you first do in your essay when you apply for college, and then people carry that through. And there's also this real sense of, who ranks where all the way through, a real emphasis on status and prestige and, the jobs that you have. And, are you like an industry leader? That kind of mentality is strong within the Harvard tribe. And so in forming that panel, I really wanted to break that down, honestly, and change the nature of the interactions at the reunion to give people a chance to connect in friendship and what's common. And that was the feedback. That was the written feedback. That was, people walked up to you and me and said, thank you so much for what you shared. And then you went on, Sally, to really change your Stanford Business School reunion. They invited you to give a talk for which you had a standing ovation, and fundamentally the same feedback from people that it really, by leading with your courage, you really opened up other people and gave them permission to be just as courageous themselves in their conversations.
Yeah, we model it for one another. And when we see someone else share a story that, clearly is something that they are living through and hasn't been easy and may not have been chosen, and all of the things that can come with trauma or challenge or obstacle. But when we do that for one another, we open the door for so much more. And it's more for us too. When people thank me, I'm often, you're welcome. I'm so glad that it resonated. I'm so grateful that I had the chance to share with you. And also I hear my own strength. So it's win-win, because it's helpful for another person. It might inspire them, or it might help them feel less alone. It's helpful for the connection between me and that person. And then the third piece is I feel my own strength. Someone could tell me I'm strong 1,000 times, but if I don't genuinely believe it in that moment, it doesn't matter because it's not my personal, it doesn't feel authentic to me. But the moments where I feel my strength the most are when I actually choose to openly and vulnerably share my story, because it's like a reminder to myself, oh, yeah,
Yeah.
this is where I've been. This is where I am. I have come a long way. Resilience, I talk about it. Sometimes it's that muscle we build, and it is something that we could build just like we can learn history or math. And
well, yeah, let's actually go there for a second, because I don't want to miss this piece about connection to yourself as well, because your cancer really moved you to reconnect with yourself, and you really dove into dancing, and your connection with your own body was a key part of your journey. Tell us about that piece.
so I began a dance journey well before cancer, but well into adult life. Like, to be clear, I was not ever a dancer. In fact, if anything, for anyone who might have been at a college dance with me, I was semi awkward on a dance floor. And then I discovered dance classes on a whim. I was 30, so it was about 10 years before cancer. And I really fell in love with what I would call the practice of embodiment, of really, really knowing my body. And that can sound like, I don't know that I would have even understood what I just said if I didn't embark on this journey, because, of course we all know our own bodies, and, we feel or touch ourselves. Like, I'm just touching my fingers right now, and you have a sensation and all of that. But really, really knowing our bodies well, and that can be anything from distinguishing like what, we talk about like light or darkness with emotion, or good or bad, but like really distinguishing like what is joy versus what is gratitude versus what is, like inspiration. How does that manifest in my body, and where do I feel those things? Or on the darker side, like anger versus sadness versus overwhelm. Like, those are so different, but we don't often have that vocabulary. So dance actually helped me to get clearer on that. It helped me to learn to express myself with my body, which as a super cerebral Harvard graduate was not necessarily my strength, right? Like the rumination capability in this brain. Yeah. I mean, even my dance teacher is like, what goes on in that head? Like it is off the charts. Like, most of my dance friends are like, wait, you were thinking about what during warm up? I'm like, well, someone said this and that I couldn't. So,
you feel the rumination in your body,
And so to be able to really, really get to know myself through my body and express myself, meaning what does different music elicit, or how do I move? And this was all pole dancing. So it was also super fun to like kind of reacquaint myself with the inner gymnast that I'd left behind a long time ago, and be able to like literally fly or go upside down, and just realize how capable, and to use that word strong from before, how strong my body was, and build strength. And there's this thing in probably any physical activity where we talk about stretches, and we usually talk about stretches in a physical way. And so we can stretch ourselves a little, right? Like an inch more, or even a centimeter more, just when you think you can't go further in a dance move or in a stretch and warm up, but you do, and you see that. And that's a little bit easier to visualize than the growth that you and I often talk about, growth through trauma, where it may be harder to see how we're moving toward a goalpost because it's more invisible. So I think dance also taught me about that kind of progress in a way that was a little bit more easily discerned than in some other aspects.
A bit more tangible. And it may have, that embodiment, as you describe it, may have saved your life potentially, because if you hadn't had such an awareness of your own body, you have told me that you don't know if you would have discerned what was going on your hip.
We have gut feels about things as humans, and I think we don't give them enough credit sometimes. And dance and like if you actually look at how we've evolved as humans, like our overthinking brains, which sometimes squash our gut feelings, like that cognitive processing, right? That's a human thing. But a lot of other animals who don't have our human brains have gut feels. Like it's literally like that's their brain is more like that gut instinctive fight or flight kind of thing. And so for me, I made a lot of my cancer decisions and, really still do by what felt right. Like rather than overthinking it, it was really about like, what am I feeling in this moment? And to answer your question about my hip, so I think it's common for anyone who's gone through a cancer journey to be scared that every pain they feel subsequently may be more cancer. I mean, we're told to be vigilant. So to be fair, it's not, out of the realm of possibility that it is. But it also can be the cause of a lot of anxiety because every single human has pains. And when you're in your 40s, you start to have more of them. And I mentioned pole dancing. When you're regularly flying around a pole at rapid speeds or just doing other fun dance moves, it is reasonable that you might be a little banged up at times or a little sore. So with that said, so for context, in 2016, I had double mastectomy and then I had several months of chemo. And then at about halfway through that year, I was all done with what was called active treatment. And I went on a hormone supplement called tamoxifen, or I should say a hormone suppressor, which is pretty common. And that was it. I was getting, periodic checkups, but for all intents and purposes, I was considered cancer-free and my breast cancer had been early stage. So there was no expectation it would return. And my mom, thank goodness, had never had a recurrence in, at that point, 25 years, now over 30 years. So I had every indication that this was going to be just like my mom's and we were good, Thank you, cancer. To your point, it's taught me some awesome lessons about connection and being able to let others in. And thank you. And like, we're good now. And about 4 months after all of the chemo ended, I felt a super subtle pain in my hip. And when I say super subtle, when my oncologist asked on a scale of 1 to 10, I said it was like maybe a 0.5. I mean, it wasn't even a pain. It was almost more akin to not even really an ache, but it was like I felt it. And we don't feel body parts usually. They're just there. And so I mentioned it. This was November of 2016. And my oncologist, whom I adore, she said, like, look, you're really active. Like, let's just keep in touch about this. And I believed her. I mean, it was so low grade. It wasn't bad. It was just there. So I trusted her. And I vividly remember a month later, because I was about to have my next surgery. So breast reconstruction is staged. I already had these, what they call tissue expanders. So like once a month, I would go to my plastic surgeons and he would blow me up a little more like a balloon. And then when you're healed, you can have an exchange for proper implants, which lasts, a lot longer. And I was about to have my exchange surgery in December of 2016. And part of that surgery, in order to make the breast look more natural and not have ripples, they do a little liposuction. And they take from, your thighs, like near your hips. And all of a sudden, the day before the surgery, I frantically called my oncologist's office. I started to connect those dots, which I hadn't thought about. And I thought, wait, you're taking stuff from there where I have this pain that may be cancer and you're putting it somewhere else. And anyway, my oncologist talked me down from that ledge, but regardless, we went forward with the surgery. Well, ultimately that pain didn't go away. And it intensified a little, still not terrible, but so it ultimately led us to do scans a few months later. And over the course of 2017, my hip was scanned about 5 or 6 times, including 3 MRIs, 1 PET scan, 1 bone scan, a blood test looking for tumor markers. Nothing popped. Like the MRI showed a little something, but it was static. It wasn't changing over time. So cancer tends to grow. So the decision was, and the pain went away. So the decision was made, not just by one oncologist, but two. And when I say two, one at Memorial Sloan, one at Mount Sinai. So these are like two top tier oncologists.
Yep. Right.
It was just my body. So I was kind of given the clean bill of health after a year of all these scans in the end of 2017. So after a full year, I was elated because I basically thought, okay, finally this hip thing is behind me and it didn't hurt anymore. And basically a week later, my oncologist felt another lump. And so that led to a biopsy of my breast, which came back positive for cancer. The odds of that are so low because I had a double mastectomy.
Right.
But it was a gift because they then 2 days later did a full body PET scan and my hip lit up. That same hip.
Oh.
And so ultimately, despite the fact that it had been dismissed, after all those scans, it was positive for what is then by definition metastatic breast cancer, which is breast cancer that's spread anywhere outside of the breast, which makes it stage 4 and incurable, words no one wants to hear, but ultimately were then sort of a new part of my journey.
Yeah. Wow. And it came from really knowing your body at a different level than most people, I think, ever know themselves. I think that's unusual. And your discipline and craft and dancing really brought you to that place. Stella is proud to partner with the Green Beret Foundation. The Green Beret Foundation provides Special Forces soldiers and their families with emergency, immediate, and ongoing support. Through their work, the Green Beret Foundation reduces the burden of life's transitions and covers the cost of life-changing care, including stellate ganglion block, for Green Berets and their partners. Visit www.greenberetfoundation.org to learn more about their mission and how you can support this organization. It's not just your individual strength. I know your story. And so I know that, your individual strength was not what got you through cancer. And it's the same for all of us with trauma, with our warfighters. The strength of the tribe is greater than the strength of an army of one. And, at a place like Harvard, we get a wonderful education. It's also sort of the birthplace of rugged individualism. And we're all sort of geared toward being really independent. But you said something really interesting to me one time, which is, I'm going to botch this a little bit so you can correct me. But the essence of it was, there were some things in my journey for which cancer deserves a little bit of a thank you card. And one of those things was how you learned to rely on your loved ones. Can you talk about that? Because I think that's such an important insight.
So as you said, a lot of us who go to Harvard, there's a lot of that independence that the school fosters that we probably arrived with as well. And I was a huge perfectionist, and everything from my grades at school were off the charts / slightly crazy, my college roommates would tell you. And I went through recruiting and got a lot of job offers. And you look at my LinkedIn, it looks quote unquote perfect. You look at my multiple masters from Stanford, right? So my academic pedigree it all quote unquote looks perfect, whatever that even means. Yeah. And I strove for that. That was really important to me. I always looked really put together at work. I was polished, all of those things. And suddenly I was handed a cancer diagnosis, and yes, I took copious notes in the doctor's appointments and may have even put together a little bit of a spreadsheet and an Excel chart after surgery for my plastic surgeon about the drain output, which apparently no one else had ever done. So I took some pride in that because I still had to be me. Yeah. But alongside all of that, cancer is not meant to be fought alone. And it was my body. One thing I always say, and I genuinely believe, it was my body, but it was my family's cancer. And so for that purpose, my family, my parents, my mom, who had gone through this many decades before. I have 2 siblings. I'm the oldest of 3. My sister had 2 young ones at the time. Now she has 3. But, my brother-in-law, like it was a full family effort. And so what that looked like was from the very first moment, the morning I found out the diagnosis. I mean, my sister went with me to the biopsy. The morning I got the diagnosis, I went to my sister's apartment. Yeah. All the things you have to do when you're newly diagnosed. I mean, the list is kind of crazy because you have to basically traffic your own biopsy samples to the doctor you want to have a consult with. They're asking me to fax. I'm thinking, I don't have a fax in this apartment. It's 2015. Like, who has a fax right now? Yeah, right. But, all the things that are so many steps that make no sense. And yet I'm on the floor of my sister's apartment with a newborn, periodically in my arms or in my sister's arms. My niece had just been born about a month earlier. My nephew at the time was just shy of 2. He was in and out. And so what a gift to have the magic of those children and to have the love of my sister. And then over the course of that day, I think my brother had a lot of meetings. We told him when it felt good because he didn't need to know in that moment kind of thing. We waited 4 days to tell my parents until they could be in the city and we could all be together, and we were with the kids, which was very strategic because again, when you have 2 amazing little humans in that room, you can't be sad for too long. Like, there were tears and it was hard. And I don't mean to minimize the dark parts, but there was also so much light and joy in that same moment because they didn't know what was going on. And so to be able to remember that in those moments of obstacle, there's also still some awesome when we look to find it. And for me, those kids for that, and like the number of friends who showed up even in that first moment. So my college roommates, what I wrote in the Red Book, I remember. So we had an obsession, just like our catchword was solidarity. And I mean, senior spring, it was like, because we knew we were going to be in many different cities. I don't think any of us were together the next year. And so it was all about the solidarity. And so what I wrote in the Red Book was roommates who pledged solidarity to each other in 1997 show up when one is diagnosed with cancer all those years later. And they were incredible. I mean, one of them came down from Boston multiple times for after surgery, for during chemo. And, everyone really was just incredible. My family, I'm just thinking about the sequence. It's all in slow motion, but just that December, every consult we went to, I mean, they had to bring more chairs into the room because everyone came. And my sister couldn't come to some of the consults because, like I said, she had a newborn, but she came when I signed up for surgery because she couldn't imagine me having that surgery without first meeting that doctor. And I'm getting even choked up now because, she didn't have to, right? But that's the beauty of family or anyone who is our chosen family, right? Because some friends fall into that category. And yet we have to choose to let people in because that's an active choice. And so even in that moment of diagnosis for me or whatever someone else's trauma might be, that ability to control that choice, because I couldn't control a diagnosis, but I could definitely control the team that I built, the people I let in. And that was huge for me.
Yeah. And boy, you called that. There was an ambulance in the background. You said, just so you know, when we start this podcast, there will be an ambulance at some point because about every 20 minutes on the nose, someone, drives by.
Inevitably. I feel like it was timed almost perfectly, not quite, but like that suspense of like, you can't choose that. Yeah. You can't choose that diagnosis, siren in the background, but you can choose, right? Do you call for help? I mean, honestly, I'm kidding, but I'm not kidding. Like that siren, that SOS of like, you build your team, and that, and my boss.
Find your tribe, and you love them hard, and they are there for you. And that has a strength that's much greater than our individual strength. Gosh, we could talk, all day long. I could just talk with stories and insights that you have. So many of them are so important. But I really, really want to leave people with you sharing a final word about what you've learned from this journey about the nature of trauma and how we heal from it.
Sure. And, one thing I'll add about that hip situation, because I think it's so helpful. So in that moment, I could have chosen to be frustrated that, the doctors, they weren't right. Right. But I remember thinking, well, what a gift, because we have, not a gift that they missed it. It probably would have been more ideal to not, but I had a year of scans that were so basically stagnant that we knew it was slow growing. So if you're suddenly dealing with a metastatic cancer, you usually don't have anything more than that one point in time initially.
You don't have a baseline.
So I had a lot of baselines. So, I just point that out because I think there are constantly moments that give us choice. And you asked earlier, again, like that timing of that hip situation. And you had asked about my Stanford speech. And I had been invited to speak at Stanford when I thought cancer was in the past, like when I spoke at our Harvard reunion. And basically there were 8 weeks that separated my yes, I'd love to do this. I'd be honored to speak at our reunion and the reunion on May 5th of 2018. And on April 11th, a week after I said yes, we knew I had a recurrence in my breast. But on April 11th, 3 weeks before the reunion, is when I learned it had metastasized.
Yeah.
And a friend had said, one of my closest friends from business school said, you don't have to do this. Like, you don't have to do this. Like, you have a lot that you're dealing with, right? I'm juggling all these consults and stuff. And I remember saying, and I share this because I think this is exactly what leads to resilience. And it was so helpful for me. I said, I do have to do this because this gives me a deadline to wrap my head around this and to show up just like at our Harvard reunion, but this was more real time, to show up how I am in this moment and to share that. And what a gift, because then I had 365 classmates who all said, how can we support you?
Yeah.
Instead of being alone on my couch, not sharing it. So I think that is, your question was about trauma and what I've learned. And I think that's a really good example of what I've learned. And it goes back to not needing to be that type of perfect that Harvard may foster. And it goes back to not needing to be independent. And it goes back to not needing to conceal or show up the way we think we're supposed to show up at a reunion or anything else in life. But
just having emotional armor and just showing up as you are. And that has made you stronger for the journey ahead of you and given you the tribe that has surrounded you.
Yeah. And it lets me find the light in the moments that might otherwise feel too dark, because, going back to the auntie and me, right? I early on talked about my nephew and niece, and now there are 2 nieces. And what a gift. Like, it is very hard to be sad and dwell in the challenges when I'm surrounded by them and we're having a dance party or doing arts and crafts, or we, instead of gratitude journal, we do our special moments at night. And there's always something special when you look for it, even on a really, really tough day. So
I wish that people could see you right now, because, we're doing this looking at each other so that we could have connection throughout this interview, but it's not going to go on video. But your face is lit up when you talk about your nieces and your nephew, and you must be such a special auntie to them. They're so lucky to have you. You're just
glowing
when you talk about them. So I just have to say that because listeners are not going to be able to see you on this interview. But I'm so grateful to you for your friendship and for just such an inspiring journey that you have shared with us.
For some of us, trauma rechannels everything. In doing so, trauma can also give us an opportunity to reassess our life plan and discover new ways to relate to those we love. Sally's story is also a compelling example of how the mind and body are connected and how trusting our gut can be life-saving in some cases. Sally and I are currently working on a project for our 25th Harvard class reunion, a podcast featuring the stories of classmates whose lives have taken unexpected turns. Our hope is to create connection between our classmates and give voice to how we can emerge from challenges with new understandings. Post-traumatic stress is not a life sentence. Trauma can be healed with the right insights, the right treatments, and the right support. The story of our trauma is presented by Stella. Visit www.stellacenter.com to learn more about Stella's breakthrough trauma treatments. Please share this episode with people you care about who have been impacted by trauma. And remember to subscribe on Spotify and other streaming platforms.